We asked everybody to circulate their papers in advance, if at all possible, so that you all have a chance to look at the material, and therefore we ask the speakers not to read out their papers verbatim, but just to talk about the issues which those papers raise. Okay, I'll share this section. Would you all like water? I'll give you some water. Okay, we'll take this in the order which it appears on the programme. So first of all, I'd like to ask Thomas Davies of City University London to speak about Robert Owen and Workers' Internationalism before Marxism.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me along. And today's paper that I'm going to present looks at Robert Owen's role in the development of workers' internationalism in a number of different respects. This work is a spin-off of a wider project I've been spending the last 8 or so years on, which is looking at the broader overall evolution of international non-governmental organisations in world politics. I'm actually based in the politics department, but my work is quite historical. And should you wish to find out more about that, there's a book available that's just been published looking at the evolution of international NGOs from the French Revolution to the present. And something that I emphasise is that, and what Robert Owen was particularly crucial in, was an important transition that took place in the late 18th and early 19th century from ancient forms of international non-governmental organisation, such as transnational religious orders, towards the modern international NGO that became more firmly established from the 1860s onwards, including in the case of the International Working Men's Association. And Robert Owen played a crucial role in creating new forms of more secular international non-governmental organisation with the welfare of what he called the labouring classes in mind. There are two different dimensions to Robert Owen's work in kind of workers' internationalism that I'm going to cover. I'll start off by talking about advocacy work at the global level, international level at least, in relation to promoting the creation of intergovernmental institutions or standards with the welfare of workers in mind. And I'll look in particular at his work at the Congress of IWCH in 1818. And following that, I'll look at his establishment of new forms of international non-governmental organisation, or INGO, or international NGO. And I'll look at two different models. One, his earliest form, the British and Foreign Philanthropic Society, and second, the Association of All Classes of All Nations, established in the 1820s and the 1830s, respectively. So, starting off with the first dimension of kind of workers' internationalism, the advocacy at the transnational level in relation to trying to bring about intergovernmental action in relation to labour standards. Owen, in 1816, had attempted to try to bring about national level legislation with factory reform in mind within Great Britain, but failed spectacularly in that effort. So he thought, well, perhaps I'll try a different kind of level to target to promote such reform, and went on a tour of Europe in 1818 with this in mind, trying to take advantage of the convening of the German Diet in Frankfurt and the convening of the Congress of IWCH that year. He found that this he came up with quite a lot of resistance, not surprisingly. So the secretary to the Congress movement, von Gens, said, well, why would we want to try to lift the labouring classes out of their misery? We don't want a master figure on wealthy and independent of us. How could we govern them if they were, was his reply to Robert Owen when he introduced his memoirs on behalf of the working classes in Frankfurt. In these memorials, there were two really important things that he, or ideas that he was promoting. One was the creation of an international commission in relation to promotion of workers' welfare, especially to examine the model of his factory at New Lanark and to see if that could be the practices applied there could be applied elsewhere in the world. So one thing he kind of helped introduce into international relations was the idea of creating international organisations with the welfare of so-called labouring classes in mind. And in addition, in these memorials, there was a very clear notion that were this to be promoted, then in Owen's view, quote, a permanent system of peace, conservation and charity would supersede the system of war. So we also see a forerunner of kind of socialist, internationalist ideas of if you promote standards of welfare at the international level, then that can also help to facilitate reduction in the likelihood of international conflict. So while he gained very little success in the short term, for instance, with respect to the memorials he presented, they weren't referred to whatsoever in the protocols of the outcome of the Congress of IWCH. In the long term, arguably, these played an important role in helping to transform understandings of what kind of thing could be promoted at the international level, and in particular, a move away from considerations of diplomacy just being about, say, territorial divisions, formation of alliances and so forth, but to thinking about what actually can be about welfare, so-called low politics issues, as well as so-called high politics issues. And from the 1840s onwards, proposals for international labour legislation became quite commonplace, and arguably Owen played a key role in promoting this idea. So that's kind of part one. Part two is new international non-governmental organisations. And there was an important transition that took place in respect of these as well. So the first one looks more similar to other kinds of new international organisations that were being created around the first 3 decades of the 19th century, many of which, based in Britain at least, called themselves British and foreign on account of British membership and foreign membership. And so Owen's first international NGO was called the British and Foreign Philanthropic Society for the Permanent Relief of the Labouring Classes, created in 1822 and founded at Freemason Hall. This organisation was definitely not an international organisation of workers. Its membership consisted in large part, at least especially at the international level, of either aristocrats or the exceptionally well-to-do. So, for instance, vice presidents included diplomats from Russia, France, Spain, Prussia, America, Portugal, Sweden, Sicily, Sardinia, and Baden and Hesse, as well as a French duke and a German baron and John Randolph in Virginia. So we see an organisation that consists in large part definitely not of workers, but it had kind of top-down provision for workers' welfare in mind. But this top-down provision was at least tempered by the idea that in the long run, at least, kind of enhanced independence of the so-called labouring classes who had participated in planned Owenite communities. So the formation of this organisation represented a further phase in the development of Owen's thought as to what he should do in order to promote workers' welfare. At first he thought, well, I'll try national level reforms, then he tried international level reforms within the kind of existing systems of society. Having found very little progress in that regard, he wanted to create his own organisations to promote these self-sufficient overnight communities with which most people are familiar. This organisation, with this kind of top-down view as to how to promote workers' welfare, didn't last very long. It didn't even last an entire year. It found that it ran out of funds, and also that Owen hadn't really provided much by way of concrete plans in order to realise its objectives. But nonetheless, this was an important organisation in being an organisation with workers' welfare in mind and through promoting international cooperation with that objective, albeit very top-down in terms of its composition. By the 1830s, on the other hand, we see more of a bottom-up approach to the extent that was possible with Owen. In the 1830s, at the national level, he was central to the creation of the Grand National Consolidated Trades Union, which was to disintegrate very quickly given the efforts that were undertaken in relation to the Tolkien martyrs. And he argued that one of the problems with this Grand National Consolidated Trade Union was it promoted a policy of arguably kind of class antagonism, that it was workers against the bourgeoisie, rather than all classes and all nations working together in harmony. So instead, he promoted in 1835 the creation of an association of all classes, of all nations, to try to promote kind of cooperative efforts with the welfare of workers in mind. Like the British and Foreign Philanthropic Society, the objectives that were promoted included education and also the creation of overnight communities, but also a transformation of understandings in relation to how people should live their lives, and also to kind of produce what he was calling the religion of charity for the convictions, feelings and conduct of all individuals. An important aspect of this organisation, in contrast with the British and Foreign Philanthropic Society, was it comprised at least in large part of workers, unlike the Philanthropic Society. And another key dimension was gender equality was important to this organisation. So it provided, quote, that every woman on becoming a member of the society was eligible for election to every office in the society, and therefore could act as delegate for Congress if she was so elected. This is extremely different to most other international NGOs of that period, like many of the at least male anti-slavery societies, although we're also women anti-slavery societies at that time. This organisation managed to create international branches as well. For instance, one got set up in Paris, and another one in New York, and a further one in Philadelphia. And there were also activities being reported, modelled on the association's principles as far away as Algeria, Australia, Egypt, and Russia, albeit some of these were being instituted by governmental actors. It was proposed in the 1840s to hold an annual Congress of Nations, given this success of international branches, but unfortunately this organisation was also to fall into decline by the mid-1840s, nonetheless lasting about a decade, unlike the British and Foreign Philanthropic Society. It fell apart in part due to financial shortfalls, and in part due to Owen's still somewhat totalitarian approach to arguing well, everyone should just adopt his model, and therefore kind of plurality was somewhat absent. Nonetheless, this organisation created considerable consternation in the governing classes. For instance, the Bishop of Exeter in the House of Lords said that Owenism had become, quote, the actual creed of a great portion of the working classes. Mere exposure to them would have done harm unless they're put down by the strong arm of the law. And one of the key problems with it was not merely an English society, but one that professed its determination to extend itself all over the world. So we see here in the mid-1830s an early example of association comprised at least in part of workers, with branches in multiple countries across the world, albeit many of these branches consisted in large part of British expatriates. So just to wrap up, we see a number of continuities from the Owenite movement to later organisations, to some of the members of Owen's organisations who later took part in later international socialist organisations, similar to some of the other organisations later to be created. Immigrants accounted for much of the total of the international dimension. But there are also some crucial differences that I'll get on to shortly. But before I do that, I think the key thing that I think Owen contributed was important steps of transition away from old ways of thinking and old forms of organisation. So it's transformation of ideas about diplomatic practices, that so-called low politics could be part of diplomatic discourse, not just high politics. And in terms of organisations, creation of international organisations with the so-called labouring classes, welfare in mind, and later actually comprised of workers themselves. But there are key differences with much of later socialist internationalism. For instance, the emphasis on education, peaceful change, and harmony rather than kind of antagonism of different classes, which led to later socialists calling him utopian socialists because of these underpinning ideas. But my very concluding point in the paper was that, well, the cooperative approach does have a legacy in contemporary world's biggest international NGO in the present day is the International Cooperative Alliance, which has 272 member organisations in 94 countries with approximately 1 billion members. Okay, so that wraps up my...
Thanks very much. We'll have all three papers and then we'll have questions and discussion from the floor. So next I'd like to invite Jürgen Schmidt from Humboldt-University to talk about transnational tendencies in a national framework of the early German movement as a civil society actor 1830s to 1860s.
Well, thanks for inviting me for this conference. Last year I published a biography about August Bebel, one of the founding fathers of the German Social Democratic Party. And with this paper I return to my main research topic about the early German labor movement between the 1830s and 1870s. In my presentation today about the German movement, I will focus on the years before the 1848 revolution. It was in this period that the German labor movement took its first starting point as a movement trying to give the wishes and demands of the workers an organizational frame. This happened not within the boundaries of the German Confederation, the Deutsche Bund, but abroad. So, at first glance, the point of origin of the German labor movement was a transnational process per se. My main hypothesis, or my main question, as you want to see it, is that the transnational actions were a precondition for internationalism. In the first part, I give, along some basic questions, a brief insight in the context. In the second and main part, I will focus on the transnational perspective and ask for the pros and cons of the transnationality of the German labor movement. Why abroad? There are reasons as well from political history as from social history. First, especially after the 1830 revolution, in France, associations with liberal and democratic aims were founded by middle classes in Germany. They were fighting for freedom of the press, democratic franchise, and a republican political system. But after several uprisings in different German states in 1830 and 1831, a period of persecution started. Therefore, some of most prominent leaders went to exile. So this is the political side. Second, with the obligation to travel in German Wanderzwang, existed an institutional regulation that forced young journeymen to leave their home after apprenticeship. With this experience, the journeymen hoped to gain additional knowledge on their way to occupational autonomy as master craftsmen. In addition, they were seeking for education, adventure, and culture. Journeymen followed well-known traditional routes throughout Europe. So this is the socialist aspect. Where abroad? Most central for the development of the associations were in the 1830s and early 1840s, France and Switzerland. In Paris, for example, lived in the 1840s about 40,000 Germans. Here existed German quarters and neighborhoods which created a sense of home and identity and with a dense network of people and institutions. In 1838, a German tailor complained in his diary that he did not make any progress in learning French, quote, because one has too many opportunities to speak German, quote end. Compared to Paris, the Swiss town Biel was not attractive for mass labor migration and building a big German community. But, as described in my paper, this small town illustrates how such places could develop to junctions of communication due to a few political active leading figures. Especially the German migrant Ernst Schüler played a decisive role. He emigrated for political reasons, 26 years old, to Biel, where he worked due to personal networks as teacher at a grammar school. In 1836, he got from the municipality the citizenship, Bürgerrecht. Schüler not only found an ideal place of refuge, but was also integrated in the society of the town Biel. became a successful businessman in the clock and watch industry, a publisher, and a local politician. Thanks to Schüler's engagement, Biel became an intersection for traveling journeymen. They found structures that facilitated community and social cohesion. On the one hand, Schüler initiated for the journeyman a reading society, Leseverein, in 1833, and began to centralize and coordinate different clubs and associations which sympathized with the republican ideas of the young Germany, Junges Deutschland. On the other hand, Schüler knew how to use the political and educational interests and the regional mobility of the journeyman to communicate and transfer ideas of the republican-inspired society, young Germany, from Switzerland to the German state. Quote, "The patriotic German craftsman is a propaganda by foot. The knapsack on his back, a lump of money in his pocket, a knarled stick in his hand, traveling from Berlin to Constance, from Vienna to Hamburg," quote end, he wrote in one of his books in 1837. I just want to mention briefly another place abroad, especially since the mid of the 1840s, for the labor movement, London played a more and more prominent role. Here a network of clubs, inns, even schools and a hospital existed. In addition, more and more left-wing activists went to London and founded there the League of the Communists. So in general, the migration to metropolis like London or Paris, as well as traveling through transit stations like Biel, contributed to the interconnectedness of the different opposite movements in the pre-revolutionary years. Who were the actors? Two groups formed as well the basis of the associations and secret societies as leading figures, intellectuals and journeymen. In the first founded associations, also some merchants and employers participated who lived in Paris. But since the mid of the 1830s, the secret societies were a connection of intellectuals and craftsmen. We find in all these organizations no unskilled workers and no women. It were organizations deeply coined by masculinity and male behavior. For example, metaphors like the honor to fight for their ideas or the willingness to sacrifice their blood for their ideals showed this male world. What organizations? One of the first and most prominent associations within the German countries was the Presse- and Vaterlandsverein, an association supporting a free press and a united German state. Its existence was so stimulating that even in Paris, German migrants founded a branch called Association of the German People, Deutscher Volksverein. In a process of radicalization, this association was transformed in a secret society which combined early socialist concepts with the idea to realize human and citizen rights in the German states, the so-called League of the Just, Bund der Gerechten. In further steps, this league moved towards communist ideas with the founding of the League of the Communists in 1847. In the beginning of the revolution in Germany in 1848, a lot of these activists went back to Germany and founded their new associations. All in all, we have a circle with the associational model first, then secret society, coming back again to associations. Especially the step towards the public-oriented organizational model instead of the clandestine secret type was very important for the further success of the German labor movement. Which media? First of all, leaflets, journals and books helped for the self-reflection within the groups and transmitted these messages to a broader audience. Quote, "In our days, the printed word exerts immeasurable influence on the attitude of the people," quote end, judged in 1843 a Swiss report about the importance of printed media for the development of German communism in Switzerland. In the pre-revolutionary years, period between 1830 and 1848, at least 74 emigrant journals were published. The number of copies for this media varied between several hundred and 4,000 copies in a very few cases. But elements of popular culture have to be considered as well. Rhyme and rhythm texts played, for example, also an important role. In addition, journeymen not only distributed the journals, they also became mediators for themselves. When these politically skilled journeymen with their knowledges arrived in inns and hostels, which this caused attention. This did not necessarily mean direct political agitation, but it contributed to the politicization of the talks of the guests. Altogether, it was decisive to surmount places and spaces by connecting them and to occupy mental spaces with new contents. Now I come to my second part and the question in how far these German associations can be described as transnational actors and where the limits for these interpretations are. First, three aspects are important for a transnational perspective. First, the German actors learn from actions and organizations that they experience abroad. For example, the 1839 uprising organized by French communists in Paris had continuing influence on the German labor movement. For the tailor Wilhelm Weitling, one of the organizers of the League of the Just, and the most influential person for the ideas of early communism in Germany, the uprising of 1839 was, quote, for the principle of communism more effective than all previous oral and written propaganda. In London, the Chartist movement in the mid-1840s influenced the model of how to organize conferences and congresses so that they reach a broader audience. In addition, in London, the Transnational international cooperation was strengthened. When in September 1844 Wilhelm Weitling arrived in London, he was welcomed by, quote, a very numerous assembly of British and foreign socialists, quote end. A year later, in September 1845, the organization of the Fraternal Democrats was founded, a loose association of left-wing Chartists, members of the League of the Just, German craftsmen, and political emigrants from different European countries. In one of these preliminary meetings, Friedrich Engels was attending too. The association's aim was, quote, to get more information about the movements in the different countries who pursue our common concern with conjoined regular meetings, quote end. When Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx founded at the beginning of 1846 in Brussels their so-called Communistic Correspondence Committee to transmit their concepts to the working class organizations in the Western countries, they had direct contacts to these fraternal democrats. A second aspect of transnationality was represented by the reception and adoption of early socialist ideas. Wilhelm Weitling wrote in a very religious style, similar to the French works of Félicité de Lamennais. The League of the Just discussed the ideas of social economy by François Barbeuf, and through these discussions came about Weitling's writings. In general, the described formation of a broader public facilitated the circulation of ideas. For example, German journals made the readership familiar with the idea of British social reformer Robert Owen. In return, Friedrich Engels wrote articles for Owen's journal New Moral World about the development of socialism on the continent. Third, the consciousness of a common situation of the workers abroad also had transnational aspects. For example, when in Paris in July 1840, French and German tailors side by side went on strike and asked in their letters their workmates in Germany to support them with financial donors. As the communist August Becker said in a speech, quote, the French and Swiss workers are so much closer to us than all German bankers, although their banks' houses may be located in the middle of Germany, quote end. Concrete financial help, transnational perception of social movements, and a clear for international solidarity went obviously hand in hand in the culture of the working class associations. However, we also have to consider the limits of the transnational view. Four aspects are of central relevance here. First, the associations, although situated abroad, were for Germans. For example, the statutes of the Democratic Educational Society for German Craftsmen in Lausanne of 1842 said that only men of, quote, German tongue, quote, and could become members. The draft of the Statutes of the League of the Just stated, quote, "The fraternization of the just consists of Germans or German speakers," quote end. Even August Becker, quoted above, who considered national pride as a, quote, "ridiculous old hat," quote end, added that, quote, "The natural sphere of impact for us Germans is mainly Germany," quote end. Second, the migrants isolated themselves from the foreign society and faced the experience of exclusion all abroad. On the one side, it remained easy in the German communities abroad to stay only in contact with their compatriots. On the other side, in Paris in the 1840s and the 1830s and 1840s, sometimes conflicts occurred between French and foreign workers. French workers, quote, "blamed the foreign colleagues for their conformist attitude and felt hurt in their pride because domestic employers favored the foreign workers," quote end. For example, in August 1839, Belgian and German cabinet makers were attacked by French cabinet makers. Such actions that argue against an international solidarity among workers and the constructed dividing lines along nationalities contributed to exclusion and obstructed transnational entanglements. Third, the transnational always included the national. The formation of a German public sphere abroad always took place with regard to the creation of a German nation. Universal aims like that of human and civil rights and European ideas of justice transferred the actors in the German association abroad into their nation-state-oriented objective. The social and the political transformation of the German Confederation in a democratic German national state. The League of the Outlaws, Bund der Geächteten, stated as aim, quote, "the liberation and rebirth of Germany and the realization of the principles declared in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens." Finally, it can be argued that transnationality was a one-way street. The receptive and integrative attitude prevailed especially on the German side. France became the ideology provider for the Central European labor movement before 1847-1848. Robert Owen and the Chartists delivered practical models for organizations to the German workers and artisans, and the structures of secret societies were learned and inspired from Italians like Giuseppe Mazzini. In contrast, German feedbacks on organization attempts in France and Britain remained very limited. So, to conclude in a few sentences, understanding transnationality as an entanglement of people, ideas, action, and organizations, we can describe the early German labor movement as an actor and as a result of transnational processes. In contrast to the later, especially the 1860s, established internationalist labor movement, this early German labor movement was much less based on an official bureaucratic exchange of opinions in conferences, but on the situation experienced in the foreign countries. These experiences created transforming processes, as I described, but one has to see the boundaries of this transnationality too. And, as I already mentioned in the beginning, one can see this transnationality as a form of precondition for organizational internationalism. But one could also argue that transnationalism and internationalism are two different developments in the history of workers and labor movements. Thank you.
The emancipation of labour, neither a local nor a national but a social problem.
Okay, I've got some copies of my paper for people who didn't see it. I'm not going to read it. I'm afraid I'm not very good at reading papers. So I'm going to sort of make some comments about the high points. I start off the paper by quoting an authority that, of course, people like to quote all the time, and that's, of course, the Pope. He says, and I quote, "Yes, these gentlemen of the International, who are not gentlemen, are the incarnation of evil, and the only thing we can do for them is to pray for them. So the International Working Men's Association has been endorsed in a sort of odd negative way by the very highest of authorities. Now, why am I looking at the First International? Because I think that often in the past, the First International has been something that's been an ornament that's been used by later movements who actually paid little attention to what it actually did or how it actually functioned. But rather, look to a certain type of social democratic laborism like the Second International, or of course the Russian-dominated Comintern, or people who look to the heroic Spanish anarchists in the 1930s, and there would always be references made to the First International, but not really any analysis. So my argument, in short, is that we should go back and look and see what we can learn from the International Working Men's Association. Although things are, of course, very different 150 years later from this European-dominated, if not Eurocentric organization, still I think there are certain lessons to be learned. First of all, I think the International's ability to win workers to the idea of internationalism is very, very important. In other words, we can't assume that workers will just instinctually go to an international perspective. So the idea of trying to promote internationalism in an active way was one of its contributions. Furthermore, in its historical context, the IWMA was a very important source of communication and strike support in a pre-internet age. If you look at the minutes of the General Council, you see they are rich with details of requests for help in promoting work actions, notifying workers in other countries not to be tricked into becoming scabs, and collecting funds for various struggles. So let me just tell one story. In the autumn of 1866, Belgian basket makers, not a huge trade these days in the 21st century, I realize, but at the time it was important. So these Belgian basket makers are brought to London in an attempt by the bosses to undercut wage levels in the trade. Now, members of the International go straight out to the workplace where they've been brought, and they point out to the Belgians that their injury they were causing on the English, in quote, getting two of them to come out of work and have a glass of drink. Within a day, all the Belgian workers in the shop had quit work and were on their way back to the continent, apparently after joining with members of the International for a little drink, as the minutes say. But it wasn't just that they went and got workers pissed so they would stop scabbing. They also took on larger political issues. So, for example, the minutes of the General Council show, which is what I basically based this paper on, that they had a lot of propaganda to show to the Irish that it was only, quote, a class of English that wrongs them, and that that same class of Irish are as bad. Or what later became, in James Connolly's words, an English boss is a monster and an Irish boss is worse. And if you look, and you can see this in my footnotes, there's a lot of evidence that the International had a lasting impact on left and labor movements within Ireland. But I think from the start, the International Working Men's Association hit upon something that's very important, something that's often given lip service to, but I think was essential to the organization, when the provisional rules in 1864 said, and I quote, "The emancipation of the working classes must be conquered by the working classes themselves. Now, all efforts aimed at that great end have hitherto failed for want of solidarity." The emphasis again on the necessity to have international solidarity between different groups. Now you see this, for example, when what was obviously a Eurocentric, if not at least European-dominated organization, very deliberately becomes formed around the question of supporting the North in the American Civil War. So interestingly enough, when the International has Marx draft a letter to President Lincoln and give it to the American ambassador to Great Britain, the ambassador gives a very public and positive response to this letter, which, by the way, is in contrast to the silence from the American embassy at various letters of complaint about the American blockade of the Confederate States that had been delivered to the ambassador. In other words, various letters like that, the American ambassador ignored. Some reform organizations who again quibbled with the abolition of slavery, letters ignored. But the American ambassador, supposedly directly on Lincoln's orders, and you can read about this more in Robert Blackburn's book, An Unfinished Revolution, Karl Marx and Abraham Lincoln, put out by Verso in 2011, shows that they were very, very concerned with this. So they were actually organizing British workers who were being hurt by the lack of cotton coming from the Confederate States and getting them to show support for the North. They were also having political sympathy actions among the London doctors and elsewhere in order to support the North. Furthermore, when war broke out between Prussia and Austria, the International condemned it as a war for empire, and it's not calculated to help the people, so we don't really care who the victor is, revolutionary defeatism. Workers were told to be neutral in such contrast. And when the Prussian Kaiser demanded Warland to fight France, very famously, August Bebel and Wilhelm Liebknecht, two members of the International, refused to vote for war credits, an action that got them, of course, thrown in jail. But they had it for a small organization, an organization that always sort of punched above its weight, as we would say. They were actually able to have a real international dimension. So, for example, in 1870, a group of workers in Paterson, New Jersey, in the United States, sent 26 pounds to London to be split equally among French and German sufferers. Now, this was not purely symbolic, because if you calculate what that would be in euros in 2012, we'd be talking about something like 21,000 euros, which would, be a small but significant contribution, particularly for, a group of workers. Also, the International had an intellectual research aspect to it, although they produced many documents. They even claimed, probably a little bit exaggerated, that the U.S. Congress had approved a bill for the establishment of a labor statistics office, and that this was passed at the express desire of the International. Now, we'll never know, because that bill was, of course, killed in the Senate, so that didn't go so far. Also, for the time, putting it in the context of the time, the International was very advanced on the question of gender equality. Harriet Law, a member of the IMWA, for example, was very, very perceptive when she talked about how machines, quote, made women less dependent on men than they were before, and would ultimately emancipate them from domestic slavery. Now, Law has all but been written out of history, but she had a very important career as a public speaker advocating secularism and women's rights. For the better part of a decade, she was editor of the Secular Chronicle, where she fought in those pages for free thought and the liberation of women. And it's really noteworthy that in a group that was obviously made up of what today would be considered male chauvinists in many sense, that the International was very willing and even excited to give Law a platform for her views. Now, often she's just sort of a footnote in history as an ally of Marx. She voted with Marx. But if you read the minutes, she didn't just vote with Marx. I mean, she was very outspoken and very active, even at council meetings where, for example, Marx or Engels weren't even present. Now, of course, there were problems in the organization, but I think that often we have the wrong perspective. Often the organization is seen as solely having been destroyed by the ideological splits between Marx and Bakunin. However, the fact is there was an extremely large amount of government repression that was brought to bear against the IWMA. So in 1868, Belgium passed a law allowing the government to exclude non-citizens from the country for any cause, and one of the causes could be membership in the International. You had the problem, of course, the International naturally had about German and Polish workers, Irish and English workers. So they're constantly fighting the sort of rising nationalism, the indigenous racism, and so on. There was obviously a lot of anti-Semitism. Bakunin, for example, when he was accused of various things, responded, quote, "This is nothing but a collection of the most perverse slander that the German Jews have thought of." So, I mean, that was the sort of things they were fighting at. They were fighting again. And Marx and Engels themselves were known for making what today we'd consider egregious racist or sexist comments. But also, I mean, let's think about this in realistic terms, in terms of contributions. Despite what you would read in the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Times of London, and so on, In fact, the International was always starved for funds. It was not a question of the International be rolling in gold and Marx and Engels and these various other people being heavily funded by this group or that group. If you look at the financial records of the IWMA, you realize that the organization lived literally from hand to mouth. That, it would be a question of Marx trying desperately to peddle, as he once put it, membership cards for, a few pennies or something, just so they could print the latest address that they wanted to put out. Now, despite all these limitations, fighting against racism, government repression, lack of money, I think the First International was very successful, given its resources, given the context of the times and rising nationalism, in promoting the idea of international solidarity. That was not easy in those times, or it was never easy, but even when the organization was correct, far-sighted and correct, as for example when they advised American workers to make no distinction between black-skinned workers and white-skinned workers, because saying if you do, it'll lead only to division, hardship, and violence. They were obviously correct on that. But the fact is that the International, despite all its problems, I think made a real contribution. And the fact is, if you look at its numbers, it wasn't that large an organization. It was argued, for example, by members of the Council that you should reveal the official membership numbers, because if the outside public ever got an idea of how small they actually were, it would reduce their influence. So, sort of like Sorel talks about the myth of the general strike, you could say it was something going on like the myth of the International. Now, you see that in that famous work of French fiction, Germinal, by Zola, where you have a character who's, in France, and he learns about the International. I think it's worth quoting this. He's just found out that the International, quote, has just been formed in London. Wasn't it a superb accomplishment to have launched this campaign through which justice would at last triumph? With no more frontiers, the workers of the whole world would rise up and unite and make sure that the worker kept the fruits of his labor. End quotation. Now, things didn't quite work out like that. But it gives you an idea of the inspiration that the International had. And also, as I mentioned previously, the fact that it took positions on all sorts of international issues that didn't have a direct bearing on the European working class in an immediate sense, like denouncing the French occupation of Mexico. But it was a threat. It was seen as a threat, perceived as a threat by manufacturers, businessmen, the bourgeoisie in general. A Swiss watch manufacturer felt it necessary to say that no members of the International would be hired in their factory. It became sort of a clause. Even in liberal Switzerland, Geneva, the authorities felt compelled to confiscate copies of the International's publication. So I think that the main thing I'd like to get across is that the International, the First International, was able to influence working class movements in a positive direction, particularly in those countries within their admittedly limited geographical and political sphere. The influence was the accepted mode of the International. It wasn't an attempt to control, as other organizations later did. So maybe it failed finally, but on the other hand, it had a great and important impact. And sort of just to conclude, I think the important thing, though, is that to say that it wasn't just a fight between Marx and Bakunin and these sort of like isolated intellectuals fighting, but it was a real living movement that, for all its positive aspects, obviously had limitations, but all the same, it really had an effect. And just one comment on the idea of moving the International to the United States, where it died, and the fact that Marx and Engels did this to save it from Bakunin and the anarchists. I make the argument in the paper that, in fact, they were maybe partly trying to save it from government repression, and their guess, which proved wrong, as guesses often do, that the United States would be more hospitable, was not so unreasonable. So, for example, you had, after the suppression of the Paris Commune, a multi-ethnic, multi-racial rally in New York City of 70,000 people in support of the Commune Arts. This is the sort of news that would make it possible for members of the General Council to think, well, maybe in the United States, where the repression is not so severe, Because you have to remember, the idea of having a rally like that in most European cities at the time, you'd just be asking for mass police arrests and police brutality and so on. So what I'm basically making is a plea that we reconsider the International Workingmen's Association as an interesting historical development, but also perhaps as a model that in some ways might be more suitable than the sort of model of the Comintern or the model of the Second International. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that the International Workingmen's Association was pure in any means. And I'd like to end by quoting one delegate from Switzerland who spoke at the Hague Congress in 1872. And he noted with what was probably a touch of irony, and I quote, "Why should the International alone be exempt from all the defects and shortcomings of the present generation, and be as immaculate as befits only the Virgin?" Now, I think that's sort of an interesting way of looking at it. So it was flawed, but one still wonders if there can't be much that can be learned from the First International. After all, unlike the Second International, it never became a handmaiden to the war machine. Nor, like the Communist International, did it become the brutal instrument of one nation's foreign policy. So maybe it's time to take a second look at the IWMA, not out of respect or nostalgia, but with the aim of learning from its flaws and from its strengths. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, thanks to all our three speakers who've been commendably disciplined in keeping us well within the time limit. As a result, we have about an hour, or up to an hour, for questions and discussion. So, I throw the floor open to anybody who'd like to ask a question, make a point, violently disagree, or whatever.
In under an hour.
Under an hour.
I was very struck in Thomas and Jürgen's presentations, the absence of reference to the French Revolution. And I was thinking in particular, in relation to Owen, about the influence that Bentham and others would have had on him, and the extent to which the French Revolution was a model or a symbol which attracted workers in other countries.
Are there any other? Take about 3 or 4 together.
Yeah, I mean, my question follows from a bit done about University of Westminster. I'm just interested, in terms of Thomas's paper, it's very much sort of presented as Robert Owen did this, Robert Owen did that. It's very much a one-man show. It's very much part of Owen's style. And his dependence very much on a group of international philanthropists and aristocrats. Was anybody else from the early cooperative movement or the early trade union movement involved in any of these initiatives in terms of travelling around all the European conference centres? But also picking up on the very first question, there's no reference at all to any of the Benthamites or radical MPs, many of whom also had an interest in international conferences and international peace. So were there any links there at all, or was this just Robert Owen, Robert Owen, Robert Owen?
Yeah, that's Stuart King, socialist activist. I'd like to say something on the First International, because I think what William says is very important in terms of looking at the lessons from that. And I think one of the lessons that perhaps he doesn't bring out is, and very important for us in Europe at the moment, is how in fact Marx managed to construct an organisation that was Marxist on the one hand, but managed to link in with a whole series of trade unions, particularly the British trade unions, that were far from Marxist, and how he managed to put forward and build an organisation that managed to bring together reformist trade unionists and Marxist revolutionaries in the same organisation, and managed it in terms of bringing them along with international sort of declarations and conferences and whatever. And I think that is something worth looking at for those of us who are trying to build, organisations in Europe that are, like the Left Party in Germany, or Left Unity in Britain, or Front de Gauche, or the MPA, how do you actually construct organisations that manage to contain both Marxists and revolutionaries and militant reformist workers, and hold them together and influence sort of the trade unions in a Marxist and revolutionary direction. So I think that's a very important lesson, really, that the first International is probably more important for us in some ways than the second and third at the moment in Europe.
Okay, my name is Tim Wetzel. So I have a question or a comment to Mr. Pelz. For in your presentation, your paper, you said that the IWMA moved to the United States to protect it from ballooning, and you told us about the feedback at the repression of the Parisian Commune had, with 70,000 people demonstrating in this multi-ethnic mass immigration city. Isn't it the question that this concept of the spirit of internationalism has just other feedback in this multi-ethnic mass immigration countries like the United States or other countries like this? There, I think the concept of internationalism already at that time has already another spirit. What do you think about this?
Okay, if I ask the panel to respond to these questions and then have another round of questions. Okay,
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, well, I've chose to focus on Owen because he was so active and played a crucial kind of leadership role, even though it's absolutely the case that he did not work alone. But he was fundamental to the drafting of the founding texts of these organisations that he created. His work in Europe in 1818, it was just a visit by him, but albeit facilitated by those associated with similar ideas in continental Europe. An important aspect of it, that this wasn't just Owen, there was the role of French revolutionaries, and some of those took part, at least on paper, in the work of the British and Foreign Philanthropic Society, and similarly the British and Foreign Philanthropic Society's membership consisted in large part of Bentonite type MPs, and so certainly, yes, it's not just Owen. I just chose to focus on him because he was absolutely fundamental to these specific instances that I outlined. The organisations that he was responsible for were by far the most clearly oriented to sort of labouring classes at that point, especially in the 1820s. But other similar organisations did not use anything remotely similar language. Okay, so I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, the question about the 1789 revolution in France, I think for the concrete outcome of the German labor movement, more important is at that point the 1830 revolution, because they had these upheavals in Germany, really the revolutions in some states, and this caused and reflects the refugees, and this really made it possible that abroad people came together, which probably in Germany would not have come together, so to say, intellectuals and craftsmen. And this was very important, and this was a result of the 1830 revolution. The 1789 revolution was important with regard to ideas and long perspective utopias, not utopias, especially what I mentioned with regard to human rights, civil society rights. These were ideas where the German early labor movement always referred to. So that's the way how the 1789 revolution comes into play too. Yeah.
Okay, first question about how your Marxism and trade unionism, that's a big lesson. I think it's very important. If you look at the minutes of the International Workingmen's Association, you find that they're very, very different than the sort of minutes when you look at Second International or the Communist International. There's very much a conscious attempt to build a class-wide and international organization. That means that Marx and Engels hold back in these meetings and very patiently try to win people to their views. They don't say, well, here's the program, take it or leave it. This is right, it's already done, it's already written. And they also try to draw people out through their work. So they try to do things, however small they may seem, that will have a symbolic impact in terms of, for example, advertising the German press to keep Germans from coming to Belgium to break the strike and all these other things. They really sort of create this image that of an all-inclusive, I mean, it's a different model, of an all-inclusive class organization. So if the British trade unionists, who are much more moderate, let's say those fellows over there, well, that's all right. That's all right. Maybe you understand the wisdom of what we're saying later, but for now we can all be together, because the important thing is pushing, you know, for the class. Now, in terms of internationalism and multi-ethnic things, yeah, I think the model of the First International makes tremendous sense in multi-ethnic countries. That's why you see it only being suppressed in, let's say, Tsarist Russia, which is multi-ethnic, or the United States, which is multi-ethnic. Because the problem is, on the one hand, it's a great model for bringing people together in a situation like that. On the other hand, you have the inherent dangers that you can play one group off against the other. The St. Louis General Strike after the Civil War, where the Germans were perfectly okay with accepting African Americans as equal, but the Irish, who actually competed with African Americans for jobs, were able to use as basically strike breakers against the strike. It looked like the Labor Party, which was sort of inspired by Joseph Wiedemeyer, a friend of Karl Marx and so on, probably would have won elections there again if it hadn't been the way racism was used to divide people. So it's a problem. It's a problem, but I think that it wasn't really just the Marx-Bakunin split that caused them to move the International. They're fleeing the repression, and I think they had great hopes, in retrospect too great, as those of us from the United States realized, all too painfully, in what could happen in the United States.
Thanks very much. Another round of questions. Deborah.
Apologies for being so late, and I only caught the last half of your presentation, and it was very exciting because the First International is. But I want to pick up also on what the comrade said there as well, because I think that I don't know much about American as I should, but there was also a lot of opposition to Marx and Marxist ideas among the moderate trade unions and the radicals. And I think that very much had an effect on the breakup of the IWMA after the Commune, because the radicals and moderates just would not follow Marx. We know that Odger, who was an important radical, and Lucraft, who was another one, left, and there was this awful big scandal. And after the demise of the First International, Marx was hardly on speaking terms with any. John Hales, who'd been a big supporter of him in the fight with Bradlaugh against the Commune, they weren't on speaking terms anymore. In fact, I think only Harriet Law and the really bizarrely named Dobson Collett, and I might be corrected here, remain mates of Marx after the demise. And I think I don't think Marx actually dominated the British moderate radical tradition, which we're still suffering from today. You know, it's been the bane of the British working class forever, has it not? And it certainly was for Marx. You know, he was. So I think that radical aspect of how these awful moderate trade unionists just wouldn't follow our dear Mr. Marx, Dr. Marx.
Heinz Sünker, Wuppertal University. Because we are just finishing the semester, I didn't have the chance to read any of the papers, so I only rely to what the three speakers said. So my first question maybe is very easy. What's the reason for arguing in favor of internationalism in all your papers? Or what are the interests of Owen, what are the interests in the different organizations in internationalism? Secondly, what came to my mind is referring to a lot of debates in the 19th, but in the 20th century too, it's all times about reform and or revolution. And then it's the question of movement or organization. And with respect to your different approaches, is it more in favor of movement or is it more in favor of organization? And then the third remark or question is, what is the relationship between some of the ideas of internationalizing and a history of social welfare? Because especially in the case of Thomas' paper, it's quite easy to see that this British and foreign friends in favor of philanthropy deal with social welfare. Do these organizations, the NGOs or other organizations in the course of the 19th century have any idea how to overcome poverty or, let's say, structural conditions? Because as we know, one of the reference points could be the Communist Manifesto in the midst of the century, and there's a clear understanding, workers of the world unite because you have to overthrow capitalism. But interestingly, no one within the three talks talked about overthrowing capitalism.
David?
Well, thank you. I'll address my comments to the first speaker about Robert Owen. I'd like to know a little more. I thought it was useful to characterise his organisations as NGOs. I've never looked at it that way. I wish the continuity between non-government organisations, and that's the question I want to address. I'd like to, if you could elaborate a little on the support for his organisation overseas, support by the state, you mentioned diplomats and aristocrats, etc., involved in all the committees as such. Did it have actual official sponsored state support? I don't know that much about Robert Owen, in fact I'm reading an old book by A.O. Morton, long time ago, and seeing references in other lots of history books. There isn't a recent biography of him, not that I'm aware of. Also the funding, I know he's a very wealthy man, and to have New Lanark as a model was obviously good for business as well as it's wider in its philanthropic enterprises. So where did he get his funding apart from his own funding? Because obviously he must have put a lot of his own money into the organisation. Did he get funding from companies, businesses, factories, slave owners or whatever, if they were still around at the time? There's still slavery going on, although the slave trade has been abolished. So, could he be seen as a kind of clean hand? Has he got clean hands, or has he got sort of lots of dirty things that the private eye of the day could have exposed him?
Yeah, I'm slightly unhappy about these Belgian basket makers. You see, at first sight it sounds terribly effective, and clearly the thing was done very fraternally, take them for a drink and so on. At the same time, what's echoing around the back of my mind when I hear this story is British jobs for British workers. I wonder whether there was any discussion, because this wasn't a case of people being in to break a strike, saying in the most fraternal manner possible, and less fraternally if necessary, go home. This was people being brought in to cut the wage rates. Now, is there not an alternative strategy whereby you say foreign workers are welcome, they are our brothers and sisters, so long as they join the union and demand the same rate as everyone else? And I wonder whether that issue was discussed at all in the first instance.
Okay, if you tackle this round of questions, we'll have another one.
Okay, so the first question, I wasn't entirely sure what was being referred to by interest, whether you meant why is this interesting in terms of internationalism, or what are the interests underpinning internationalism? But in terms of this, and there was a related question about why use the term NGOs. And so the word international wasn't used in either of these organisations created by Owen. The word international only entered the English language publication of Davies' works in the 1830s. And to my knowledge, the first organisation to call itself international was the Scottish Peace Association in 1834. And subsequently some French organisations called themselves international from 1830s. The terminology kind of penetrated discourse in the 1830s, after these organisations had been established for the most part. Why use the term NGOs? I think it was sort of way before the term NGOs entered language, which was with the UN Charter in 1945. Well, structurally, these institutions were much the same as what we call NGOs in the present day. And the first organisations to gain consultative status with the UN, with the label NGO, were obviously established long before the term came into common discourse. I believe you can take back terms even if they weren't actually used by people themselves at the time. And some of the questions that were raised about relationship to the development of kind of welfareism. Yeah, certainly this was all part of a trend in which people were thinking about how to address problems of welfare, especially in the context of the First Industrial Revolution. So the British and Foreign Philanthropic Society was just one of many internationally oriented organisations of this period from the late 18th through the century, and including one that was based in Norwich, the Scots Society of Norwich, an organisation that still exists into the present day, the Society of Friends of Foreigners in Distress, for the last 200 or so years, social welfare, but it's a very small organisation. And overthrow of capital. Well, Owen definitely considered these ideas. What kinds of solutions are there? But again, his approach is very much more cooperative, about harmony of plans. So overthrow of capital would be happening through a peaceful process of emulation of his models of cooperation, rather than through and finally, did Owen have clean hands? Funding was always a struggle. For the most part, states tended to very much oppose rather than support his work. But there are exceptions, and Owen was pleased to report on work in Algeria. This might be kind of tarnished hands in a sense, in that so the French governorate in Algeria was attempting in part to adopt cooperative models to its governance in Algeria, and Owen seemed quite proud of that. So there's a not clean hands part of it. It was basically just emulation of his model.
Yeah, perhaps some comments. You mentioned that why there is organization interested in using internationalism, so to say. I think it's really an outcome of their personal experience, the experience they had abroad. For example, we have sources where, especially then these master craftsmen of tailors and shoemakers, they reached Paris or Brussels or somewhere else, and they really experienced that there will be no possibility ever to realize what they are thinking of, to become an autonomous craftsman, master or something like that. And so there was a kind of experience and yeah, even feeling that one should or one had to work together to find another strategy. And this relates to the second question. It was not enough only for a movement. They also had this feeling that there had to be another step to come to an organizational model. And so this is really connected to this experience the workers had abroad and going outside their home countries. And yeah, the relationship between this organization or movement and social reform in Germany, of course, had the aspect that the real decisive social reforms came much later under Bismarck, but we already had in the 1830s some social reforms, for example in 1839, a law against child work or something like that. But it was, I would say, not really related to this organizations of this early socialist and labor movement. It was really comes out of the reform processes within the German national state. And what you said about alternative strategies, I mean, within these organizations, there was, of course, the strategy, for example, that strike breakers do not come into the cities, and that there was a discussion about the strategy, how what could prevent these things. But on the other side, we have this, what I described too, this really national rivalries between different working groups of French workers and German workers. So I think discussion and ideas is on one side, but the practice and the reality of nationalism existed and had to be discussed within this group.
Okay, just a few comments, response. Deborah, right? Yeah. Yes, this whole thing about Marxism and moderate trade unions, I think one way of looking at it, which is perfectly plausible, is how you presented it about how this was turned out so badly, but looking at it differently, I think it was amazing that they ever got together at all. And then, no, if you think about it, I mean, sort of, can't speak about the TUC, but being a member of the AFL-CIO union, I can certainly speak to how hard it would be to even present anything even mildly Marxist to the people at the Chicago Federation of Labor. And they sponsor May Day demonstrations. They're considered on the left of the AFL-CIO in Chicago. So, I mean, I think the big achievement was even to get these people, you know, to involve it. It took us, like in Chicago, 2 decades to get the Chicago Federation of Labor to acknowledge that May Day is our Labor Day, even though it was born in Chicago and so on. So finally, they've done it under pressure mainly from Latin American workers who consider it the Labor Day and tend to strike on May 1st. But now they do it. So that's one thing. Now speaking to Heinz's question about internationalism, movement versus organization, I think what the First International realized, maybe prematurely, was globalization, as we would call it today. Remember, Engels himself worked for a German firm, right? His family was a German firm in Manchester, right? So you're already starting to see that sort of international spread of business. And they realized that as business is starting to spread across borders, the workers would have to spread across borders. No other possibility if you're going to be successful. Now, movement versus organization, that's a very tricky dialectic. And I think it's very possible to, you know, fall into one of the two problems, just movementism, where, you know, it's just important to do things and no structure is really important. Or on the other hand, preserving some sort of structure, some sort of organization, and not really worrying about the movement. And I think what was interesting about the First International is they certainly realized the importance of structures, but yet on the other hand, they were constantly trying to be involved in movements. And again, there were many mistakes and so on, but in terms of perception, I think that was very important. That they just didn't want to build an organization. One thinks in England of, you know, the ossified socialist organizations of various sorts that were around at the time of Engels and Eleanor Marx and so on. You know, the first show ever, so on, as Eleanor Marx would call them. But they didn't just want to throw themselves into the movements willy-nilly. I mean, so they tried to have a combination of both. And our Belgian basket makers that Ian is so concerned with, probably rightfully because of their health, I mean, livers and all that. The fact is that, yes, there was an element of protectionism that appealed particularly to more moderate trade unionists. But the main thing was the idea that rather than cutting wages, you should bring everybody up to the highest wages within the world working class, which admittedly for the Eurocentric First International, they mainly thought of in European terms. But they also had some thoughts about, like, for example, in the United States, or even in Brazil or Argentina, even as far as field as New Zealand, of trying to push the idea that people should always put forward that if you're an immigrant, if you're a migrant, your job is not to undercut wages, but rather to try to get the wages to rise to whatever the highest standard is. Now, in practice, of course, this is much easier said than done. But, you know, there was also a very fine line between people being brought into great strikes and being brought into lower wages. Because if you read the details, the minutiae, the International, first they bring in workers from abroad to lower wages, then the indigenous workers go on strike, and the foreign workers break, you know, across the picket lines. And so it's, I mean, they're trying to head that sort of thing off. So, well, there's certainly, particularly among the moderates, with nationalism, I think they had the right general approach. Again, particularly when you think about it, in terms of taking these basket makers out for a drink and so on, a personal approach rather than like in the United States, what would happen is there'd be an online petition. Dear basket makers, we the undersigned 3,000, 4,000, 300,000 people who sign everything that we get from MoveOn want you to not lower wages in the basket making industry. And if you continue to do this, we will put out another petition. I mean, it's different, In France, the workers get angry, they have a strike. In Britain, they get angry, they go on a picket line. In the United States, we have online petitions. So.
Okay, another round. Axel, then Axel.
So Axel Fischels from SUNY Potsdam. I have two questions for Bill concerning the fate of the First International in the US. How inevitable was its decline and dissolution, in your opinion? Was there anything that could have been done differently, and were there any different debates and alternative perspectives on what should be done and what shouldn't be done, and so on and so forth? And related to that, are you aware of any declarations, any views proposed by the First International regarding what happened to Native Americans? You mentioned their views regarding racism and slavery, but was there anything about what happened to the indigenous people and the genocide perpetrated on them?
Well, my name is Ad Knotter. I'm from the Netherlands, Maastricht-University, and I want to make a comment and also ask a question to Mr. Schmidt. First, I want to come back on the basket makers, and I think it's very important to understand that the prevention of the import of strike breakers is at the heart of the International itself. It was the very cause to start an address. The London Trades Council in 1864 issued an address to the workers of French with precisely this content, that they wanted to prevent workers to be brought into England to break strikes, which they had experienced in the period before, with the great London building strike in 1861, for instance. But there are many, many examples of actions by the International to prevent strike breakers to be brought in by employers from Europe, from Scandinavia, from France, from Belgium, from the Netherlands, whatever, Germany, Paris, but the intention was not to was to keep up the British wages, which were of course among the highest in Europe. And the way to do this was to organize internationally to stimulate workers in other European countries to take action to organize to get higher wages, so there wouldn't be any necessity to come to London to undermine London wage system. So I think the whole basis of the International as it existed between 1864 and 1873 was precisely this issue. Then my second point is that the International was established by a combination of French and British workers. But the funny thing is that in the General Council, the Germans were very overrepresented, especially because so many Germans were working in London. So in this period of the First International, the German workers in London had a very international outlook. They, and I think they could build on experiences which Jürgen Schmidt describes in his paper. I think there is a connection between the international character of the labor markets by especially German craftsmen and tailors and shoemakers and the like, and their participation in the international. And that brings me to another, or the question which is central to your paper, the relationship between internationalism, transnationalism, and nationalism. It's an issue which comes
in other papers, it's very important in other papers. I think it's really at the heart of the discussion about internationalism. Is there really a contradiction between the way the German labor movement oriented internationally and their ideas about German nationalism at that time? So it wasn't German nationalism at that time seen as a progressive idea that could be easily reconciled with an international orientation, concerns well, solidarity of workers internationally, etc. So I think it's a very important issue you raised. I like your paper very much, but I wonder if there's really this contradiction to be constructed.
Ramin Tagim from Vienna. I have two, one comment and one question. Also picking up the picture of the Belgian basket makers. Maybe an interesting parallel, what I will partly talk about in my topic as well is, for example, the Iranian migrant workers in the Baku region in the early 20th century, in the oil belt, in the oil industry particularly. So what the case was that they were also mainly used, or for example, used as strike breakers based on quite low class consciousness and inexperience with unionized struggle. The answer of Russian Caucasian workers in this particular case was on the one side helping to establish an Iranian Social Democratic Party, and by that supporting the organization of workers in the Caucasus as Iranian workers, and at the other time, on the other side, supporting constitutional revolution in Iran itself. So as the idea changing the social and economic conditions of the country that people came from to establish a foundation of where migration would be eased and the pressures on the Caucasian labor movement would actually be eased. So I think that might be an interesting case because you also mentioned that the Belgian workers were actually won over for the International Working Men's Association. My question in to Thomas's and Williams' input is in regard to, so when we recognize that the internationalism in the period we're talking about, and actually until 1914, was mainly Europeanism, so it was encompassing the European world or the Western world, and maybe partially the colonies of where Europeans were migrating to. What was the position of the non-European world in the debates of Roger Owen, and I was actually interested, what were the branches outside of Europe doing, you were mentioning? And yeah, so what was the position in the, for example, International Working Association of the non-European world?
Yeah, Rainer Tosco from Mainz University. Well, one comment and one question. The comment is also on related to the basket maker question. No, because yeah, but in the National Secretariat of Trade Unions was formed. One of the essence of the work of the International Secretary was to put together international labor statistics, wage statistics especially, in order to give this argument to any worker in any craft around the world. See, this is the highest wage whichever country can be gained. So do the same. You can do this the same if the capitalists say they can't pay, then they are stupid capitalists. They are not on the best level of what capitalism can do. But in the end, of course, this labor statistic proved the German wages were the highest. And so in 1914, Legin said this the war is about preserving the high German wages and to put the high German wages but to all other countries. But because this is always a question in a competitive market economy, you have arguments that you can that have a progressive side, but which could turn into, because of the mechanisms of competition, into a very negative argument. But this is the one thing. The other thing is, well, related to the question of, well, why, how, under which conditions the First International ended. Of course, political think the organizational cleavages are very important. But what about the general economic conditions? And this is not only refers, of course, to the time period after 1870, but in general in the long 19th century. But this is only an idea. I'm referring, of course, to the discussion among economists about these famous Kondratiev cycles, which for several decades favor economic upswing and then economic downturn of several decades. Maybe this is only a question I can raise. There are also interrelations between this political organizational side and the general economic conditions, which, of course, you can only figure out after long research. But so it's a question for future discussions, perhaps, only this interrelation between the economics and political and organizational fields.
Okay, if you'd like to tackle those points, Thomas.
Okay, on the question of is this all really not international, it's just kind of Europeanism. For Owen, he certainly had a kind of Western orientation, but it was perhaps more Anglo-Saxonism than Europeanism. He would refer to the Anglo-Saxons in America as kind of the pioneers of everyone else would then copy. You would see his models happening there first and then progress where these writings. For the development of internationalism more generally, however, one of the things I would argue is that there arguably, as in so much of what's been done Western civilization, there are Eastern origins of Western internationalism. So if we look at some of the earliest international NGOs of the modern era in relation to things like rescuing the shipwrecked at sea in the late 18th century, they emulated both techniques and forms of association that were witnessed by the Dutch, especially in China. And so arguably the starting point is the East, not the West, if we look about internationalism generally. And on the point about internationalism and nationalism, I think there's a strong case for arguing that they very much developed hand in hand. If we're thinking of the 1830s, organisations like Young Europe were both voting nationalism and in the context of, at the same time, promoting internationalism. Just as Owen viewed perpetual peace as being the outcome of promoting the welfare of the labouring classes, or nationalist groups like Young Europe, perpetual peace would be facilitated by democratic nations across the world.
Yeah, thanks for your comments. Just as Thomas said, I think it's the same with the Young Germany. You also have in this association of the Young Germans the idea of a national state, but with a broader context or broader meaning of nationalism, I would say. So this really can be found very closely together. But with your first remark about the strong influence of the Germans in the 1864 organization and afterwards, I mainly referred in my paper now for the period before the Communist Manifesto, so to speak. And there I really would say that it was more the one-way street where the Germans profited more from what we learned from abroad than the other way around. But on the other side, we of course had already in the 1830s, 40s, these structures I shortly mentioned with the German inns and German even hospital and schools and organizations which were rising. And then we had this 1848 revolution coming, another generation and even more radical revolutionaries took to London, and so London really became a center, and so there is really a connection between this period 1848 and onwards to the 1860s and the foundation of the IWCH. The second about transnationality and internationality, yes, you're also one, I think, that has to divide the periods, because I would say the 1830s, 40s, really nationalism in Germany was something progressive, but to put it bluntly, it lost its innocence in 1864, 1866, 1870, 1871 in these wars.
Yeah.
So this is, I think, the main decisive point that nationalism was in the pre-1848 years something one could build on, even on a more advanced and progressive style, which was impossible for those left-wing immigrants being in London in the 1860s. So I think it's a very decisive point.
Okay, first I'd like to take the last comment in the beginning. And the economic conditions may well have been a factor. And that's just something I'd have to do more research on, because I'm not exactly sure how much the long trends of capitalism one way or another had a direct impact on the international. But it certainly did. It certainly did. I just couldn't speak to the specifics. Now, as to the fate of the international in the United States that Axel brought up, I think, yes, they could have done things differently and perhaps betterly and more correctly and so on. But they also were moving it to the United States, maybe partly out of desperation and exhaustion, fear of repression, but also based on a false hope. That false hope had been developed by Joseph Liedemeyer, Union officer, virtually military dictator of the St. Louis garrison during the Civil War, and a good friend of Karl Marx's. And that theory was that giving African-American freed slaves the vote, or male African-American freed slaves the vote, would mean that you would have potentially a left-wing labor majority that could work either through the Republican Party, take over the Republican Party. Liedemeyer himself was elected assessor in St. Louis County, or form an independent labor party. And that the immigrant workers from Europe, who were influenced by the International, would reach out to the African-American workers, and they would have a majority. And Marx had even made noises that maybe you could have things peacefully change in the United States and so on. But the general trend, regardless of different opinions about this whole theory, was that the United States after the Civil War was going to be moving in a severely leftward direction. With the destruction of Reconstruction, without going into too much American history, that hope vanishes. That hope of a steady march to the left, which was indicated by early social legislation and so on, passed right after the Civil War, not only just the abolishment of slavery, but extending the Bill of Rights, which had only applied to the federal government, to the state governments, etc., etc. That's all over, roughly by about the same time the International shows up. And given the communications problem, it also means once the International comes to the United States, without being able to actually take off in the Western Hemisphere, they're cut off from their European roots, both through repression and just from the whole problem of expense and time. So that's part of it. Now, the IWMA didn't necessarily develop a coherent position as far as I know on Native Americans. I know there was a lot of sympathy for Native Americans, particularly among German Americans who have sort of romanticized Karl May thing about Native Americans. I mean, as late as the DDR, they're making romantic movies about Native Americans. So there was interest in it, but the main focus was, of course, on industrial workers. So these people were sort of beyond that. Although Carl Schultz, who was a 48er, was in the Grant administration, was known as one of the people who was more helpful to Native Americans than most people had been. Now, in terms of the question, it says something that really you have to look into more. Question about the International outside the European world. That's absolutely true. It was a Eurocentric, European-dominated organization, but it had aspirations, should it have existed further, to become truly international. And I think it was trying to hook up, or hope to hook up in the future, with those international currents that were fighting against national currents. One example is South America. The whole project of Bolivar to unite all Spanish speakers throughout the continent, rather than breaking up into local, regional, whatever nation states, was a project that, in a lot of ways you could say the International very much approved of and saw not that they're big supporters of Bulbar politically in a lot of ways, but as an example, the idea that, well, if you take all of Spanish America and make it into one country, one broad place, that would be a step in the right direction. Just like Brazil, which we now assume is one country, at various times there were tendencies that said, well, look, this is a huge place, we should be many separate countries all speaking Portuguese. So, you know, there were hopes there, but also they didn't have on the ground many people. Didn't necessarily have a great deal of knowledge, and quite frankly, they were preoccupied with, you know, European affairs.
We've got time for one more round of questions. First of all, Steve.
Steve Cushion. Again to the vexed question of the basket makers.
After retitlement, paper. Karl Marx, the International and Basket Makers.
But on your more serious point of a comparison with the Second International, at least, at worst, there's ambiguity here. Whereas, of course, by the time you get to the Second, or the organisations that made up the Second International, I mean, I found something in one of the Mayday editions of a French socialist newspaper, which has got, most of it is like greetings from the workers of France to the workers of someone else. And then at the bottom, there's, under the heading Yellow Peril, there's a report of a speech by Paul Lafargue attacking the idea that Chinese workers could ever be expected, could ever be allowed to work in a new textile factory. So, and that is just sort of complete, just complete vile racism in that sense. So I think, you know, at least whatever the faults of the way they handled it, the First International, it was ambiguous. But by the time we got to the Second, it was just complete.
Short addition to the question, so I will Eurocentric vision of the First International. The First International section in Montevideo was founded in 1871. The First International section in Buenos Aires was also founded at the same time. So it wasn't it wasn't a European immigrant in South America, but really the first sections of South American part of the International was in the early 70s. And to give additional information that nobody told us before.
Absolutely.
Yeah, very quickly, with respect to the history of ideas, because Jürgen mentioned the group Junges Deutschland, Young Germany. The leading figure of the group was Heinrich Heine, as I would say, the most relevant writer and poet in German language. And he invented the term Weltrevolution, World Revolution. And I think it's relevant for the debate on internationalism that Karl Marx in his Paris manuscripts from 1844 took up a lot from Heine because he met him and they discussed very seriously. So internationalism and world revolution, I think, is this connection in the midst of the 19th century. And secondly, we have, because the Germans just became some prominence here, we have to be aware of the fact, and Walter Graf has shown that very clearly, that in the aftermath of the wars of Napoleon, there was a very strong split between the Germans, although I doubt that they ever exist, and the French, which never exists too. So the hate on the French was a starting point which had to be overcome with these processes of internationalism. And the question is, was that successful? And all the Francis said, we won't end at August 1914. I think this is the tradition if we take the longue durée.
Any other questions?
Can I make a tiny point?
Go on.
It's a very small point, but Keir Hardie was very opposed to immigration. If you read the report, the TUC reports, when he's sort of demanding a statutory 8-hour day, he's also attacking the immigration into the Ayrshire coalfields. He's absolutely furious that there are 500 foreigners in Ayrshire.
Okay, so I'd like to give our speakers a chance to answer the
role in the kind of the beginnings of the modern peace movement, and certainly in terms of the development of Robert Owen's ideas. His association with people like William Allen of the peace movement, therefore part of the internationalism.
Yeah, I think these were mainly comments for me. I just only want to add, because there was this Chinese question. I think what one perhaps even could also look is the question of these lazy blacks, if they also played a role in this internationalism and how we're looking at these lazy blacks. That just came to my mind. And the question about this tradition between first and second internationalism. You wrote, I think, in your paper that the myth of the first international was stronger than reality. So maybe that's also a very important thing one should have in mind, why we perhaps can look with a more positive view on the first international when we look at the second international.
Okay, on the first and the second international comparisons, I think you're absolutely right about the myth, and that's why it maybe looks more positive. But the other thing is, I agree with the classic argument by James Joel in his book, The Second International, where he talks about the problem of the Second International is that it was dominated to some extent, many of the parties were funded, at least indirectly, by the SPD. So you have an international that is dominated by one nation. And he says that was also, of course, then becomes a problem with the Communist International. Now the thing about the First International is it wasn't dominated by any national party in the same way. And I think that's part of the difference. And the fact that I think the anti-war stance of the IWMA was much, much stronger and much more deeply rooted than anything in the Second International. I think it was more just rhetoric. As shown by the fact that at the height of German nationalism, during the war, which is going to make Germany a nation, Bebel and Liebknecht have the courage to not vote for war credits. That is sort of remarkable if you think about it, because this is the making the German nation, the dream of 1848. This, there's tremendous political pressure on these two Eisenacher members of the International, but they refuse to vote for war credits. I think that's an indication of a much deeper rooted level against war. Opposing the French intervention in Mexico speaks to the point that was made about Latin America and so on. I didn't mean to suggest that there were nothing in the International there, but it was a project that had not fully taken off. So I think that's another thing. Partly it's the myth, but also I think it was partly the structure, that they really were seeing themselves as an international structure of workers, not as an alliance of political parties, which would, of course, then bring in the question of professional politicians or certain countries wanting to dominate and so on.
Okay, right, thanks very much. I'd like to thank once again all our speakers for a very stimulating, fascinating session this morning. And I've got something else to ask. So thank you to all three of you. And for your questions. Okay, some announcements. Firstly, lunch. There are various options available on campus. Those of you who aren't here all the time know about them already. The nearest place you can get some lunch is the Sainsbury's Centre, which also has quite an attractive permanent art exhibition as well as temporary ones for which you have to pay, but the permanent art exhibition you can get into for nothing. That's just down here, it's about 50 yards away. Somebody, I'm not quite sure, one of us will be leading. Who's going there who knows where it is?
You do.
Okay.
You just volunteered.
Other options, there's the canteen on the main campus, and for those who are on a tight budget, there's also some about the other end of the campus. There's the cafe at the language school which will do really quite a nice meal for £3.50, but that depends on what you do. We have an hour for lunch. Okay. Secondly, if you haven't signed in, please do so on on your way out or way in. Chris has got the list there. Thirdly, if you are speaking and you haven't made yourself known to me, please do so, because with the weather being what it is, I know one or two speakers have been unable to get here, and if I need to sort of reschedule the programme a bit, I need to know who's here and who's not here, otherwise we may have some wrong speaking panels or whatever, which could be a bit awkward. And finally, the meal this evening, Matthias is going to be booking the tables for. Should we say that our people by the beginning of the next session will let you know how many you want?
I'll put, you can sign up here, I'll put a piece of paper here and you just write your name down and gather numbers up.
Okay, so we've got to get onto Ali sometime early this afternoon, so if you want to come along by the start of the next session, you can find your own evening meal arrangement somewhere else. Not this, anything short.